This manga is about me, Jinguji-jo, who was isekai'd to another world just because Truck-kun started acting up again. But luckily, a goddess gave me the power to bring all my equipment with me, including a freaking gun. Watch the whole video if you want to know how I dominated this world with my military skills. The title of my story is Bocchi Jieikan no Isekai Funsenki. Now, it's showtime.
Jinguji found himself questioning whether he was already dead. But then he realized that time had just come to a halt. He encounters a woman with wings on her back, accompanied by a dog. She informs him that his death is near. His name is Jinguji-jo, a 21-year-old recent graduate of the National Defense Academy. He recalls the moment he leaped out to save a girl from a dump truck that ran a red light. The woman explains that she has stopped time and is speaking directly to his soul. Jinguji initially thinks he might have died and gone to heaven, but realizes something is different. The woman kindly acknowledges that she must have caught him off guard. She apologizes for the late introduction, revealing that she is the deity he knows as God. Jinguji's expression hardens upon hearing this. She continues, explaining that she is one of the managers of time and space. To learn more about his world, she sent one of her retainers, his dog, to Earth. She admits that this dog was meant to help the girl. However, it seems he lost his sense of security while he was there. He inadvertently led the girl in front of the truck while chasing a butterfly. Because of this mistake, Jinguji was involved in the accident. She bows deeply, apologizing sincerely. Jinguji remains silent. She acknowledges that it must be shocking for him to learn that his death was due to God's error. Jinguji, however, thinks that if she truly is a god, she must be the superior being of all mankind. He remembers his military training, where he was taught to stay perfectly still while a superior officer was speaking. The goddess continues bowing in apology. She then turns around, mentioning that they don't have much time. With her hands extended, she offers a proposal as an apology. She asks Jinguji if he will allow her to reincarnate him. A human-like figure appears in her left palm and earth in her right. She promises to create an exact copy of his body, soul, and memories and transfer them to a different world under her management. But time is running out for this process. Once time resumes, it will be impossible to transfer his living body. She explains that her authority can't hold time still for long. She doesn't want Jinguji's life to end this way and asks if he will accept her offer. He takes a deep breath. Jinguji then loudly asks the goddess a question, surprising her. He wants to know if it's impossible to perform this reincarnation in his original world. She, looking resigned, explains that once death is confirmed, it cannot be reversed in the same world. She apologizes, admitting that it's beyond her authority. Jinguji raises another question. He asks if there's any way to communicate with his family or friends after reincarnation. She regretfully informs him that this isn't possible. She explains that the world they are heading to is entirely different. She asks him to understand that he won't be able to see them again. As images of his loved ones flash through his mind, Jinguji bites his lip and asks one final question. He wants to know if the girl in front of the dump truck will survive. The goddess's eyes widen slightly at his question. She smiles, assuring him that thanks to his actions, the girl is safe and uninjured. He salutes her, a confident smile on his face, and requests to be reincarnated into the new world. She thanks him for his decision. She then tells him that to survive in this new world, she will grant him her blessing. He asks if this is a blessing from the goddess. She confirms and tells him she will give him new power. She urges him to remember what she is about to tell him before reincarnation. As soon as he reaches the new land, Jinguji wonders if he's truly in another world. He looks ahead and sees a statue of the goddess. He wonders if he's in a temple. The statue, however, has no arms. He checks his arms and realizes they feel no different, questioning whether this is truly a copied body. It feels as though he's been instantly transported to a different place. He notices movement nearby. He thinks there might be something there. As he looks around, he sees a pathway. He reasons that if he follows it, he might reach a village. He remembers the goddess's blessing. He knows that if he wants to make it through the forest, he'll need equipment. He raises his hand and summons a Type 89 5.56mm rifle. He realizes this is his inventory, an ability granted by the goddess. Apparently, this ability allows him to store and retrieve items at will without limit. In addition, the goddess said she gave him something he should have had before he died. He exhales in relief, reassured as he looks at the rifle in his hands. It worked. This was the equipment he was supposed to receive once he was assigned to his post. He completes his gear by putting on the helmet, standard issue for the ground self-defense force. Looking up, he salutes the statue of the goddess. He thanks her for her assistance, vowing to make the most of this new life she's granted him. He recalls his interview as a recruit. They had asked him why he wanted to join the self-defense forces. He had responded that he wanted to be someone who protects lives, someone who shields the innocent. As a self-defense official with the power he'd gain, he believed he could save more lives. That's why he's glad he acted swiftly, saving a life back then. If that's how he died, he has no regrets. But it's still not enough. Wherever he is, no matter how many times he's reborn, he knows he can still do it. He can still protect someone. Suddenly, he sees a light and realizes it's the exit. A distant scream reaches his ears, and he starts running. A giant ogre had attacked a carriage, gripping one of the horses in its hand. It takes a bite, tearing the flesh apart. Belle, lying on the ground, prays desperately for the creature not to come near her again and again. A man nearby shouts at her to get up. That's when the ogre's eyes lock onto her. It brings its head close to her, licking her face. The man curses, drawing his sword, yelling that he won't make it in time. Belle shuts her eyes in terror. Just as the ogre extends its hand toward her, before anyone can react further, a bullet strikes its hand, severing 2 fingers. The next shot hits the ogre in the head. Belle looks up in surprise as Jinguji kneels before her, asking if she's all right. He offers his hand, telling her to take it. She blushes, reaching out to take his hand. But then she pulls back in fear. The shadow of the ogre looms over them, and she screams for him to watch out. As the ogre closes in, ready to strike, Jinguji swiftly turns and stabs it in the eye with his gun. He briefly muses about the kind of world this is, where giant demons attack people. But no matter what kind of world he's in, he grips his gun, assuring her that it's okay and promising to protect her no matter what. He turns to her with a confident smile, telling her she'll be completely safe. She watches him, standing between her and the bleeding monster. Jinguji Joe curses as he flicks his gun, realizing that a few rifle bullets won't be enough to bring it down, but he still aims at the creature. He's determined to find out what he can accomplish in this world. Jinguji Joe shoots the ogre in the head, feeling a brief moment of satisfaction, but then he notices that the ogre isn't alone. There are more of them. He quickly fires another round at the approaching ogres, warning them not to underestimate the power of a Type 89 rifle. As the bullets hit their marks, the ogres start to fall, and Joe thinks it's working. If he focuses on headshots in full auto, he can take them down. He spots the last ogre standing and tells himself it's just one more. But suddenly, the ogre vanishes from his sight. It lunges at him, and Jinguji Joe steels himself, trying to aim, but realizes he won't make it in time. Before the ogre can reach him, it's struck by an arrow and a sword in midair. Jinguji Joe, shocked, turns around. He sees a man with long hair shouting that he'll help him out, telling Joe to do that thing with his rifle again. The ogre, now enraged, pulls out the arrow and sword embedded in its body. Jinguji Joe thanks the man, noting with some surprise that they're speaking in Japanese. He recalls the goddess telling him during her blessing that he would be able to communicate normally. Joe raises his rifle and takes aim at the ogre. But the magazine is empty. He's out of bullets. Joe mutters to himself, realizing just how intense this world is. With the immediate threat neutralized, he wipes the blood off his face with his thumb. That's when he notices Belle on the ground. He's confused for a moment, realizing that in the rush to help her, he hadn't noticed earlier that this girl has bunny ears. Belle hesitantly tries to thank him, but before she can finish, the man who helped Joe slaps him on the back in excitement, exclaiming that what he did was incredible. He keeps patting Joe's helmet, amazed at what he believes to be explosive magic. He says he's never seen anything like it. The woman who shot the arrow awkwardly laughs while holding Belle in her arms, mentioning that the leader got a little too excited. Their chatter is interrupted by a voice coming from the carriage. The voice asks if it's safe to come out now. Gilbert smiles and tells Antonio that it's safe. Antonio steps out, muttering in amazement that Jinguji Joe managed to take down so many ogres by himself. He calls Joe an incredible magician and extends his hand, thanking him for saving them. Antonio introduces himself as a merchant. Jinguji Joe, realizing this truly is like a fantasy world, shakes Antonio's hand and introduces himself. Antonio comments that Jinguji is quite an unusual name. Joe explains that Jinguji is his family name and Joe is his given name. Antonio's eyes widen in surprise. He and the others kneel before Jinguji Joe, assuming he's a nobleman from another country, and ask for his forgiveness for any rudeness. Joe quickly tells them to rise, denying that he's a noble. He thinks to himself that this could be problematic. Joe claims that he's not a noble and, playing along, says that his memory is a bit hazy, suggesting he might have amnesia. He tells them he doesn't remember exactly who he is. Antonio, looking concerned, asks if Joe perhaps came through the lost forest north of here. Joe internally exclaims that the place he was just in must be the lost forest. He tells Antonio that's exactly where he came from. Antonio mutters that he suspected as much. Behind him, Gilbert comments that Joe must be a lost one. The women exchange glances, and Belle calls him a poor guy out of pity. Jinguji Joe wonders what being a lost one means. Antonio and Gilbert discuss how losing one's memory is common after escaping the lost forest. Gilbert mentions that Joe was lucky to have made it out alive. Joe realizes that there's more to this world's story than he initially thought. Antonio offers Joe the chance to accompany them to the city, suggesting that Joe must be in trouble. He tells Joe that since he saved their lives, he wants to bring him to the city and properly reward him. Joe agrees. As they travel, Antonio explains to Joe, who is pretending to have amnesia, more about this world. There is magic and demons here. It's a fantasy world just like in games and novels. The culture and society resemble medieval Europe, with walled commercial city-states as economic centers. Many people in the city belong to guilds, such as the Production Guild, Merchants Guild, and Adventurers Guild. The city they're heading to, Sveni, is an independent city-state governed by an assembly, without nobility or royalty, alongside the church and the garrison. This group was formed by Gilbert and Hannah from the Adventurers Guild to escort Antonio, a member of the Merchants Guild, while he peddled his wares. Antonio comments that losing their horse and carriage was unfortunate, but being able to collect 3 ogres is a stroke of luck. Jinguji Joe is surprised to learn that the ogres he killed are valuable. In this world, demons are dismantled and used for materials. Antonio explains that tanning the hide of an ogre can produce strong armor. Joe thinks that while powerful demons are tougher to defeat, they're worth a lot. A demon as large as an ogre can fetch a considerable price. Antonio assures Joe that he'll purchase the ogres from him. Joe agrees. Hannah praises Joe's abilities, and Gilbert jokes that he could live for a year without working with just one ogre. Joe suddenly realizes he's earned 3 years' worth of money. As the carriage bumps along the road, Belle accidentally bumps into Joe. Belle quickly grows flustered and instinctively grabs her ears. Joe realizes with some surprise that these are real, not a costume. Antonio chuckles and comments that it seems Jinguji-sama doesn't remember Beastman either. Then he gently prompts Belle to introduce herself to Jinguji-sama. She hesitates but eventually agrees, thanking Joe softly for helping her earlier. Belle introduces herself as a servant under Antonio-sama and shyly hides behind her ears again, muttering that it's a pleasure to meet him. Antonio laughs, noting that Belle seems embarrassed. Joe, on the other hand, can't help but think of Akihabara. He recalls that bunny-eared maids were something he only saw in maid cafes in Akihabara, and to find a real one here, it's almost unbelievable. With a serious expression, he responds that he's pleased to meet her, though internally he's unsure how to react. She's just too cute. Antonio, noticing Joe's attire, asks if he can inquire about something Joe might remember. Joe nods, agreeing easily. Antonio gestures toward Joe's outfit, commenting that it's quite unusual, especially the pattern. He asks if Joe can tell him what the fabric is called. Joe understands why Antonio, as a merchant, would be interested in his equipment, but he knows people in this world won't comprehend it. He doesn't want to draw too much attention. So, Joe decides to pretend he's recalling something. He thoughtfully places a hand on his chin and says he believes the pattern is called camouflage. He adds that his memory is a bit foggy, so it might take some time to remember more. Antonio, satisfied with the answer, tells Joe it's fine and to take his time. He then points out that Joe's helmet has the same pattern. Joe replies that it's called a Type 88 helmet. Antonio praises its craftsmanship, clearly intrigued by the design. Joe thinks to himself that Antonio is really getting into it. Antonio then comments on Joe's magic-activating wand, asking if he can hold it to take a closer look. Joe quickly checks his rifle, making sure the magazine is empty and the cocking lever is in the hold-open position. He figures there's no risk of an accidental discharge. He hands the rifle over to Antonio, who thanks him and begins inspecting the weapon. Antonio comments on its weight, noting that while metal magic wands aren't uncommon, he's never seen one this heavy. Joe watches him carefully, hoping Antonio doesn't ask too many questions. Antonio remarks that it's the most elaborate wand he's ever seen and asks Joe what he had to do to obtain it. Joe tenses up, but Antonio quickly backtracks, apologizing for his curiosity and handing the rifle back to Joe. Antonio explains that for a lost one, like Jinguji-sama, such an item must be very important. He laughs awkwardly, admitting that he has a bad habit of getting overly excited when he sees something unusual in the market and apologizes again for his rudeness. Joe, turning away shyly, thinks that Antonio seems like a genuinely nice guy. He wonders if this is what people mean by someone being a charmer. They continue chatting during the carriage ride, with Antonio's questions persisting until nightfall. Eventually, Gilbert announces that they'll set up camp for the night. Everyone starts settling in. Antonio instructs Belle to prepare the meal, and she bows before leaving to do so. After she leaves, Joe's eyes widen as he sees Gilbert pull a long piece of bread from a regular-looking bag. Then Gilbert pulls out a candle holder, making Joe wonder if the bag is an inventory. He muses that inventories must be common in this world as magic tools. They're expensive items, but only the owner can use them, making them essential for travelers. Joe contemplates that it shouldn't seem unnatural if he uses his own inventory to take things in and out of his backpack. Belle soon returns, announcing that the food is ready, and hands Joe his plate. He can't help but think dreamily that a maid from his wildest dreams is serving him food. He thanks her sincerely. Belle shyly hides behind her ears again, hoping the meal suits his taste. She then sits beside him. Joe internally exclaims that eating next to a blushing maid is the best, and after taking a spoonful, he declares the food delicious. He reflects that even though it was a sudden encampment, they invited him to dine with them. He feels like he should share in return. So Joe offers to share some of his portable food supply with them. Antonio asks if he's sure. Jinguji assures him it's fine. Thanks to the goddess, he can take out supplies once a day. During the goddess's blessing, she explained that his inventory would replenish itself daily with items from his previous life. However, items from this world wouldn't be replenished. Those were the conditions. This means he can simply wait for a day for his bullets and food to replenish. Antonio and Gilbert look confused when Joe pulls out what he calls combat rations. He explains that these are canned foods, commonly used as combat rations. Joe demonstrates how to open them with a can opener, which piques Antonio's interest. Joe continues, explaining that by heating the cans in hot water for 30 minutes, the food is ready to eat. After 30 minutes, Joe announces that the food is done. He presents the combat rations, canned chicken and rice, canned rice with 5 mixed ingredients, and canned white rice. The side dishes include canned wieners, canned beef with vegetables, and canned hamburgers, along with pickled radish. Joe invites them to share and enjoy the meal. The group looks at the canned food with amazement. Antonio compliments the aroma, while Gilbert asks about the little puffy things. Joe explains that it's cooked rice made by boiling it. Belle, serving herself, happily comments that it looks delicious. Antonio picks up a piece of pickled radish, remarking that he's never seen such yellow flat pickles before. Joe guesses that there's no other food in this world that resembles Truck-kun. As they all take their first bites, Joe watches, hoping they like it. All 3 of them exclaim that it's delicious. Joe, relieved and happy, enjoys his meal as well. Belle notices that Joe has already finished eating and comments on it. Joe chuckles, admitting that he seems to have a habit of eating quickly. Gilbert hands a plate to Hannah, encouraging her to try some of the food. Joe smiles, watching the pleasant scene unfold before him. He thinks that it's only his first day in this new world, and he's already exhausted. He wonders what kind of place the town they're heading to will be. Antonio can barely contain his excitement when he hears about the shelf life of canned goods. He eagerly asks Joe how they're made and is stunned to learn that canned goods can last for 2 years. Just then, Gilbert calls out from the driver's seat, informing Antonio-sama and Jinguji-sama that they can see it now. Joe realizes that they've reached the free trading city of Sveni. Sveni is surrounded by walls that protect the city. As they approach the city gate, Joe notices that the carriages are neatly lined up in rows. Gilbert happily explains that this is where everyone gets their cargo inspected and their IDs screened. Joe starts to worry, realizing he doesn't have an ID. He wonders if the guards will turn him away for not having one. As their turn approaches, the guard asks them to report their cargo and identity. Gilbert excitedly announces that it's their turn. He calls out to Amanda, a beautiful lady in front of them. She smiles, reminding him not to hold up the line by fooling around. He laughs and apologizes, then mentions that they're carrying the body of an ogre this time. Amanda is surprised. Gilbert urges her to take a look, and when she sees the ogres in the barrels, she's amazed, especially that one person managed to take them down alone. Gilbert grins and playfully grabs Joe by the shoulders, teasing him about Amanda's surprise. Joe notes that Gilbert seems to be having a lot of fun. Then Gilbert asks Amanda if she's confirming their identities next. He pulls at the pendant around his neck, and Joe immediately recognizes it as a dog tag. Gilbert states that he is Gilbert, an adventurer, and has no criminal record. Amanda confirms his identity. She then turns to Antonio and Joe for their IDs. Joe, realizing he might be able to use something from his world, pulls out his stainless steel dog tag from the ground self-defense force, showing his name, ID number, and blood type. Amanda examines it for a moment before confirming Joe's identity and welcoming him to the free trading city of Sveni, since it's his first time there. Gilbert comments that Joe must be a metal ranker, which makes sense given his powerful magic. Joe, confused, asks what a metal ranker is. Gilbert explains that guild members are ranked based on their abilities and achievements. Antonio adds that a metal ID is only issued to those above a certain rank. Gilbert then shows off his own dog tag, continuing to explain the ranking system. Antonio is in the upper third rank, while Gilbert and Joe are in the lower first and lower third ranks, respectively. Joe acknowledges that both of them are his superiors. Joe reflects on his previous life, recalling that he was a first sergeant in his world and had been promoted twice. Gilbert suggests they all have a drink with Hannah sometime. As they head to the Adventurers Guild to report the completion of their request, Joe follows Antonio to the Merchants Guild Hall. Antonio mentions that he has some business to take care of at the Guild Hall. As they enter the building, two ladies warmly welcome Antonio-sama. He greets them back, introducing Joe as his guest, and asks if they can take him to the back. The ladies bow to Joe. One of the women, with short hair, politely informs Joe that weapons are not permitted inside the building. She apologizes for the inconvenience and requests that he refrains from using his cane. Joe feels embarrassed, realizing he's being watched by two beautiful women. During his time at the National Defense Academy, Joe's exposure to women was minimal, with less than 10% of the students being female, so his immunity to such attention has slipped away. He quickly agrees to their request. Belle, noticing the interaction, excuses herself, saying she'll go prepare some tea. Joe watches her curiously as she leaves, but Antonio calls him over, reminding Joe to follow him. Once they reach their destination, Antonio invites Joe to take a seat. Joe looks around the room, impressed by its grandeur. He begins to suspect that Antonio-san might be a very important person. There's a knock on the door, and Antonio invites them in. An elf enters the room. Joe immediately notices her ears. He thinks that maybe elves really do exist in this world, and it turns out they do. Her gaze briefly meets his before she turns back to Antonio, mentioning that his late arrival had them worried. Antonio chuckles and apologizes for causing concern. He excitedly shares that he genuinely thought he was going to die this time because they were attacked by 3 ogres. The elf woman anxiously repeats, "3 ogres?" But Antonio reassures her, saying there's no need to worry because Joe-sama here killed the ogres and he's unharmed. She looks at Joe again, her gaze lingering longer this time, as if assessing him. She then asks, seemingly puzzled, if this is the man. Joe wonders if she's wary of him, thinking that his appearance must be unusual enough to warrant such a reaction. It feels odd to him when a beautiful woman stares at him as if judging him. Her gaze should be cold, but for some reason, Joe feels his resistance to women growing stronger. Despite her fixed stare, Joe doesn't lift his eyes to meet the elf woman's gaze. Suddenly, Belle enters with a trolley, cheerfully announcing that she brought some tea. The elf woman immediately embraces Belle, wrapping her arms around her. Belle looks startled. The elf woman expresses relief, saying she's so glad Belle is safe and asks if she's hurt. Belle hesitantly assures her she's fine. Joe watches them, and for some reason, seeing this makes his heart swell too. His emotions are at their peak now. The elf woman turns to Belle and asks if it's true that this man saved her. Belle, flustered and shy, confirms that Joe did save her. The elf woman looks unimpressed. She bows to Joe and apologizes for the delayed introduction. She introduces herself as Eldra, vice president of the Sveni Merchants Guild, and thanks him for saving President Antonio and Belle. Joe stands up, extends his hand for a handshake, and introduces himself as Joe Jinguji, saying it's nice to meet her. He wonders if she's the president or the vice president. She then turns to Antonio, advising him to be more careful with his travel plans in the future. Antonio laughs and apologizes. Joe looks at Antonio, puzzled. Antonio asks if he hasn't mentioned it before, and much to Joe's surprise, Antonio-san is revealed to be the president of the Merchants Guild. Joe thinks that in the self-defense force, this would make Antonio like a general. He realizes that Antonio-san must have deliberately kept this information quiet and apologizes for the late introduction. Antonio places a hand on his drawer and mentions that now that introductions have been made and tea has been served, Jinguji-sama is already familiar with the identification board, right? He pulls out a similar board. Joe nods, saying yes. Joe recalls that Amanda-san had one as well. Antonio is trying to uncover the identity of Jinguji, who is pretending to have amnesia. He uses the identification board to track where Joe's dog tag is registered. Joe wonders what a dog tag from his original world would reveal. Antonio examines the board and exclaims, "Here it is." He says that Joe is from the country of Azuma. Joe looks at him questioningly. The elf woman answers for him. She explains that Azuma is an island nation located far to the east of the continent they're on. She takes a sip of tea and continues, saying that when she sees Jinguji-sama and hears about the country of Azuma, it reminds her of the hero Kojiro from the last Great War. Joe slowly processes this information as she goes on, saying that Jinguji-sama is a lost one. She explains that about 80 years ago, there was a war of aggression by the Demon King and his demon army, where the demons suddenly attacked all the other races simultaneously. And the hero who emerged unexpectedly during that war was Kajiro-sama. With Kajiro-sama's help, the outnumbered resistance forces were finally able to defeat the Demon Lord's army. After the Great War, Kajiro-sama left on a journey to find his homeland. At the end of his journey, he founded the country of Azuma. She adds that from what she's heard from the elves who fought in the Great War, Kajiro-sama's appearance is strikingly similar to that of Jinguji-sama. The surroundings remind Joe of Japan and his original world. He muses that, if it was Japan 80 years ago, that must mean, Eldra continues, explaining that they couldn't find any other clue besides the country of Azuma. She apologizes to Joe, saying she wishes she could be of more help. Joe feels a pang of guilt inside, knowing he's hiding the truth. She then suggests that the stories about Kajiro-sama and the country of Azuma might hold the key to uncovering Jinguji-sama's identity. Eldra mentions that someone in the elven village might have more information and offers to write a letter. She promises to update him when she learns more. Joe agrees, eager to learn more about Kajiro and Azuma, deciding to rely on Eldra-san for this information. Belle bows to them and takes her leave. Antonio lets her go. Joe, curious, asks Antonio where Belle is headed. The president replies that he sent her on a small errand. They both watch as she departs. Antonio then notes that it's almost lunchtime. He asks Joe if there's any food he doesn't like. A servant greets Antonio warmly, thanking him for coming. Joe looks around and realizes they're in a high-class restaurant. Antonio remarks that it's been a while since his last visit. He didn't make a reservation, but he wonders if the back room is available. The servant reassures him that they're always ready to accommodate him. Joe is internally amazed at the VIP treatment Antonio receives. Joe watches as Antonio and the elf woman take their seats. Eldra runs a hand through her hair and mentions that there's some wine that arrived this morning from a Western winery. Antonio, excited, says that they always produce a good batch, and they could go with that. He turns to Joe, asking if he's okay with alcohol. Joe eagerly agrees, saying he'll have some. Antonio is pleased, noting that many young people these days don't drink. In Joe's mind, the correct response to a superior's offer is always a resounding yes or gladly. Antonio comments that it might be a bit early, but it should be fine. He suggests they toast to the safe return from their journey first. Joe wonders about the first part. Suddenly, a loud voice demands to know where Antonio is. Joe quickly turns toward the voice as Antonio laughs and calls out that he's over here. Joe wonders what's going on. A very angry old man with a long beard barges in, yelling at Antonio that he has no time to waste. Antonio lightly suggests they have a drink here. The short old man approaches, scolding Antonio for calling him in the middle of work. He grumbles that Antonio just sent a crybaby rabbit with a lisp to the smithy. The old man stops in front of Joe, who is watching him intently. Joe had guessed that if elves existed in this world, dwarves might too. It turns out he was right. The old dwarf glares at Joe and demands to know who this young man is. Joe extends his hand to the dwarf and greets him warmly, introducing himself as Joe Jinguji. The dwarf scowls upon hearing Joe's family name. He swats Joe's hand away, declaring that he doesn't like nobles. Joe's first thought is that dwarves are quite cranky. Antonio lets out a light-hearted laugh, trying to ease the tension. He calls out to Tendardono and begins to explain about Joe. The dwarf seems slightly apologetic once he realizes that Jinguji-sama is a lost one. He apologizes for his earlier behavior, and Joe quickly notes that dwarves are straightforward and honest. Antonio explains that he called Tendardono here to show him something, a thing called canned goods that Joe had introduced earlier. He presents the canned goods to Tendar, explaining that they can be stored for up to 2 years. The dwarf examines the can, repeating the information, and remarks that it can last for 2 years. Antonio continues, asking if they could create something similar, and inquires whether Tendar thinks it's possible. Tendar looks slightly offended by the question. He grabs the canned goods from Joe's hand. Antonio chuckles at his reaction and calls for more wine to be brought. After the meal is served, the dwarf repeats the steps Joe explained. He mutters to himself, "First, seal the cooked food in a steel container, and second, remove the air." He asks Joe if that's correct. Joe confirms it and adds that this method reduces bacterial growth. The dwarf takes a swig directly from the bottle and asks how to remove the air. Joe admits that he doesn't know much about that part. Tendar slams the bottle on the table, exclaiming that Joe is a lost one with memory loss. He points at Joe with a forkful of steak and says that Joe must have gone through a lot. He then encourages Joe to remember later, but for now, they should eat. Joe happily notes that dwarves are kind-hearted. Joe looks at the delicious steak on his plate, holding his fork and knife. It's the first time he's had fresh steak since his reincarnation. He cuts a piece. As soon as he takes a bite, he realizes it's beef. He can't believe he's eating beef steak in this new world. The rich flavors of the meat and vegetables in the sauce delight his taste buds. He looks at the dish, and an idea strikes him. The dwarf looks at him expectantly, saying he got it right. Antonio, equally excited, confirms that Joe's right. If they could can this, Antonio thinks he could sell it. The dwarf sees its potential for use, and Joe simply wants it for himself. After finishing the meal, Tendar wipes his mouth and says he's heading back to the forge. Antonio suggests they have a meeting about canned goods later at the Merchants' Guild Hall, and the dwarf readily agrees. Joe notices that the dwarf eats faster than him, watching as he jumps off his seat. Tendar pulls out a pocket watch, surprising Joe. Antonio comments that Jinguji-sama seems familiar with the watch, which further suggests he might be related to Kajiro-sama. The dwarf explains that the watch was passed down from Kajiro-sama during the Great War. Thanks to the clock, elves and dwarves, who perceive time differently from other races, were able to work together effectively. Antonio adds that the watch Tendar has is an exact replica from that time. In addition to standardizing time, Kajiro-san also established uniform units of weight and length in this world. Kajiro-san changed the course of the war not just through his strength, but also by altering their tactics. Later, at the meeting place, the dwarf arrives and apologizes for being late. Antonio cheerfully tells him that everything is already prepared. Tendar examines the draft and suggests that since iron conducts heat, they can heat the cans in hot water. Antonio, excited, says Tendar will be surprised by how tasty it is inside. However, Joe reminds him that this is actually canned food they haven't tasted yet. Antonio looks even more excited at that. The canned combat ration Type 1 curry is ready to be served. Antonio asks Joe what kind of dish it is. Joe starts pouring it onto plates, explaining that it's a sauce made with spices called curry, typically served over white rice. Antonio, rubbing his chin, says he's never seen anything like it, but the aroma is definitely appetizing. Meanwhile, Eldra looks less than thrilled with the arrangement. After serving, Joe invites them to enjoy their meal. Both men take a bite and enthusiastically comment on how delicious it is. Joe is pleased that they like it. However, he notices Eldra staring at her spoonful of curry rice as if it's the most unappetizing thing in the world. He watches her carefully as she forces herself to take a bite. Concerned, he asks her how it is. She replies that it's not bad, but she's struggling to describe it. She starts to sweat, admitting that it's a flavor that can't be summed up in one word. Joe takes this as a good sign and feels satisfied. His resistance to women increases again as he sees her gulp down a glass of water. After this, Antonio-san and Tender-san engage in a lengthy discussion about what foods to can. Since obtaining the equipment to create a vacuum might be challenging in this world, Joe considers starting with the heat processing method instead. Belle enters the room quietly, apologizing for interrupting their meeting. She leans in and whispers something to Antonio. After hearing her, Antonio asks what she thinks about what happened at the Adventurers Guild. She responds that the person insisted Antonio come. Antonio hums thoughtfully, then says it can't be helped. He turns to the others and suggests they wrap up the meeting for the day. Both Tendar and Joe look at Antonio, puzzled. Antonio then asks Jinguji-sama if he would join them on an errand. He explains that they're headed to the Adventurers Guild. When they arrive, they find Gilbert waiting for them, who waves enthusiastically when he spots them in the crowd. Rubbing the back of his head, Gilbert apologizes for the sudden summons. He adds, with some surprise, that even Tendar-san came along, to which the dwarf angrily replies that he does what he pleases. Gilbert, puzzled, asks why Tendar is upset. Joe notices the crowd and wonders what's going on. Gilbert yells for everyone to make way. As the crowd parts, they see two people arguing. The man with a shield on his back shouts that he doesn't believe such nonsense. Gilbert calls out to one of the men, referring to him as his brother, and says he brought him here. The other man thanks Gilbert, saying that if the person who was there at the time is present, this fool will finally believe him. This person is Gilbert's brother, Albert, the guild master of the Adventurers Guild. The man with the shield grows even angrier. He turns to Joe, accusing him of being the braggart. He yells that there's no way someone like Joe could take down 3 ogres on his own. Antonio tries to calm the situation, addressing Goliath Dono and asking him to relax. Antonio assures the others that, although it's hard to believe at first glance, it's true. Belle and Gilbert immediately back him up. Goliath becomes even more infuriated, claiming that everyone is trying to deceive him, his whole body trembling with rage. He sets his shield down and declares that even he, a C-rank adventurer known as Goliath the Ironclad, couldn't defeat an ogre alone. He insists there's no way a young man like Joe could have done it. Joe is unsure whether Goliath is confident or just unsure of himself. But Joe realizes he might have inadvertently offended the upper ranks since Goliath is among the top 3. The dwarf, Tendar, speaks up, suggesting that if Goliath is so adamant, he should test Joe's strength. Word spreads quickly through the arena that Goliath is challenging the new guy. Belle looks worried. Goliath puts down his sword and shield, stating that as Tendar-san suggested, he'll use his armor and shield as a row of targets. Tendar advises everyone to stand back. He begins preparing a fireball in his right hand. He hurls it at the shield, but it leaves no mark on it. Joe watches in awe, thinking that this is truly amazing, real magic. He notes solemnly that the shield remains unscathed. Goliath, with a smirk, asks Joe if he saw that. He boasts that this is the power of an ironclad shield. He explains that the sacred wood and steel plate covering it will repel any attack, even magic. Joe admits that it's impressive for a shield to repel fireballs like that. Goliath, still boasting, says that the power of Goliath's shield is real and that he'd like to see Joe's explosive magic as well. Tendar adds that if Joe wants to apologize to Goliath and back out, now is the time. But Joe declines the offer. He decides to take on the challenge head-on. Recalling his training in the army, he remembers being instructed to shoot targets while in a prone position. He assumes the firing position and declares that he's going to challenge the ironclad shield himself. Goliath grows puzzled when he sees Tendar covering his ears and asks the dwarf what he's doing. Tendar calmly replies that the young man, Joe, had advised him to cover his ears before Joe performed his explosive magic. Joe takes aim and fires his rifle. The shield begins to spin wildly before crashing to the ground, completely shattered with multiple holes punched through it. Goliath's mouth hangs open in shock. Gilbert wears a satisfied grin, while Albert shares the same stunned expression as Goliath. Everyone else in the arena stands frozen in disbelief. Tendar repeats, as Joe had warned, that it was wise not to make Goliath the target. Joe sighs, rises to his feet, and checks his rifle, noting that he's out of ammo. The crowd in the arena finally erupts into cheers. Gilbert mutters that it seems everyone is now convinced of Joe's power. Goliath mourns the loss of his shield, but the dwarf pats him on the back. Tendar tells him to bring the shield to his workshop later, adding that the repairs will be expensive, though. Tendar-san then calls out to Joe. He comments on how interesting Joe's machine gun is. Joe realizes that Tendar-san seems to have some knowledge about firearms. The dwarf, noticing Joe's tense posture, reassures him not to worry. He says he'll keep referring to it as explosive magic. In return, Tendar asks Joe to share his story later. Joe can't help but note once again that dwarves are indeed cunning. Albert gives Joe a hearty slap on the back, just as Gilbert had done when they first met. He exclaims that what Joe did was amazing. He continues patting Joe's helmet, expressing that he's never seen explosive magic like that before. Gilbert laughs, teasing that his brother got too excited. The elf lady, Eldra, notices that Belle is still holding her ears, and gently tells her she can let go now. Belle slowly releases her hands from her ears. She then spots a woman leaping over the walls of the arena and calls out in confusion, "Anchan?" Anchan lands gracefully and immediately approaches the guildmaster, Albert, with urgency. Albert asks her what's going on. Panting heavily, Anchan announces that there's a serious problem near the northern village. She reports that a wyvern has appeared near her hometown. Albert, concerned, asks if she's certain. Anchan confirms it, explaining that a messenger from the village arrived at the guild just moments ago. She turns to Joe, clutching his arm, and pleads with him, saying that if it's him, if it's the man who performed the explosive magic earlier, she's sure he can defeat the wyvern. She begs him to come to her village immediately, pounding her fists against his chest in desperation. Albert tries to calm her down while gathering more information about the northern village. He shouts orders to his men, telling them to return to the guild and request a guard dispatch as soon as possible. Joe, still trying to understand the situation, asks Tendar-san what a wyvern is. The dwarf looks down, explaining that a wyvern is a small dragon. He adds that wyverns are the smallest of the dragon species, but they fly fast. Their scales are as hard as steel, and most troubling of all, they love to eat people. Joe turns to him in disbelief. Anchan looks even more worried after hearing this. Albert continues issuing commands, calling for all metal-ranked adventurers to participate in the wyvern hunt and all leather-ranked mages to join in as well. Meanwhile, Goliath is still staring at his destroyed shield. He turns to Albert, asking the guildmaster for permission to borrow the guild's equipment to replace his gear. Albert readily agrees, telling him to take whatever he needs. Joe, feeling a pang of guilt, apologizes to Goliath for destroying his shield with the attack. Goliath glances at Joe for a moment before turning away, saying it's not Joe's fault. After all, Goliath was the one who initiated the challenge. Goliath asks if Joe is coming along and says he'll be counting on him. Under Albert San's command, a subjugation team is quickly assembled. Joe observes the scene, noting how disciplined and organized everyone becomes in an emergency, much like the military. Gilbert asks his brother how they'll reach the village. Albert replies that during the day, the fastest route is to take a swift horse along the city road. As they continue discussing, An-chan interrupts, urging them to hurry and head out immediately. Albert tells her to wait, pointing out that the sun is already setting. He explains that even city roads are dangerous at night due to demons, and even with horses and night vision, it's risky to travel in the dark. Albert concludes that if they can't find a safe route, they'll need to leave early in the morning. An-chan, distressed, cries that they can't wait and must help the village as soon as possible. She clenches her fists and mutters that their village was attacked by a wyvern once before. She recounts how her brother and friends were attacked back then. She breaks down, saying she doesn't want to see that happen to anyone else again. Joe, determined, makes up his mind. He calls out to Albert San and Gilbert San, telling them he'll head to the village ahead of the group. He assures them that he can avoid the demons and that he'll make it through the night faster than any horse. Gilbert turns to President Antonio, asking if Joe is serious about this. President Antonio, intrigued, responds by saying he's eager to see what kind of tricks Jinguji-sama has up his sleeve. An-chan, excited, trails behind them, catching their attention. She exclaims that they're right and confidently states that Joe is an amazing magician capable of using powerful, explosive magic, so she's sure he'll save the village. Gilbert, puzzled, asks her about her outfit. She explains that Joe wants her to show him the way and that he lent her his helmet for the iron horse they're about to ride together. Both Albert and Gilbert are baffled by her words. Suddenly, Joe appears, flashing his motorcycle lights behind them. He declares that he'll reach the village before anyone else and protect everyone there. The guard at the village gate noticed a light flickering in the forest. His partner, alarmed, asked if it was a wyvern. The guard denied it, pointing instead to the light shining through the trees. Joe was making his way to the village with An-chan. At the northern village chief's house, after a brief discussion, Joe muttered that there were already 6 victims. The village chief, Lot-san, informed him and An-chan about the current status of the wyvern attacks. The wyvern apparently only strikes at dawn. However, that doesn't mean it won't attack at night, and the villagers have been losing sleep because of the constant threat. Joe noticed that An-chan had grown tense with worry. He placed a comforting hand on her head, assuring her that everything would be all right. Joe then turned to Chief Lot, requesting more information about the wyvern's behavior. After the discussion, Joe and An-chan took up watch at the outpost. Joe used his binoculars to survey the area while An-chan remained quiet, her gaze downcast. He suggested she eat dinner. Joe reminded her that they would take turns keeping watch, and if she stayed nervous all the time, she wouldn't be able to act when the moment came. An-chan tried to protest, but her stomach growled just then. Joe chuckled, commenting that she must be hungry. He handed her some food, and An-chan looked at him curiously, asking what it was. Joe explained that it was katsudon, his favorite dish. In addition to his GSDF equipment, it seemed the goddess had also placed some of his personal belongings from before his death into his inventory. An-chan marveled at the warm meal, saying that she'd never smelled anything like it before. After eating, she happily declared that it was delicious. Joe noticed that Anne had calmed down and began opening up to him about her past. She told him that her parents had died when she was young, leaving her and her brother to fend for themselves in the village. After losing her brother, An-chan decided to become an adventurer. She hugged the bow she carried, explaining that it had belonged to her brother and that if she could defeat the wyvern with it. Anne leaned against Joe, thanking him for listening to her, admitting that she had ended up talking a lot more than she'd expected. As she closed her eyes, a warm thought crossed her mind. Being with Joe somehow reminded her of her brother. Joe suddenly shouted, snapping her out of her slumber. Anchan quickly stood and joined him. In the distance, a dragon-like figure soared over the village. Joe asked if that was the wyvern. He told Anchan to get ready, and they prepared to execute their plan. Joe waited for the wyvern to approach, his rifle poised. According to the chief's information, there was only one wyvern. When it targets people for attack, it flies in a straight line. The wyvern swooped down toward Joe, who aimed carefully. Just as the chief had mentioned, the wings were the creature's weakest spot, unprotected by scales. Joe fired at the inside of the wyvern's wings, hitting his mark. The wyvern crashed to the ground, but managed to rise to its feet again. Joe guessed it must be from the wind pressure. The wyvern screeched in pain as an arrow struck its eye. Anchan stood nearby, her bow drawn. Seizing the moment, Joe launched his mini-missile launcher at the wyvern. The missile hit its mark, detonating with a massive blast that took out the wyvern in an instant. As the smoke cleared, Anne cautiously uncovered her ears and called out to Joe in concern. Joe stood over the wyvern's body, his foot planted firmly on its head. Not far from the battle site, Gilbert commented on the size of the explosion. One of the others cursed under his breath, lamenting that he had missed it. Members of the Adventurers Guild arrived shortly after the wyvern's defeat. It seemed they had set out just before sunrise and taken the shortest route. Tendar, the dwarf, was furious as he asked Joe why he couldn't wait for their arrival. Joe, sensing Tendar's frustration, thought to himself how dwarves can be selfish, but kept his thoughts to himself. Joe walked over to Goliath, calling his name to get his attention. He offered Goliath some of the materials he had gathered from the wyvern, asking if Goliath could use them to repair his shield. Goliath's face lit up instantly. He practically leapt for joy. Joe couldn't help but think that Goliath-san was unexpectedly cheerful, and he was glad he had followed Tendar-san's advice before leaving. Tendar chimed in, reminding them that the repair costs would still apply. Gilbert turned to Anchan, telling her how amazing she was, and playfully remarked that her arrows had scared the wyvern. Anchan laughed, pleased with the compliment. Gilbert added that if they returned to the guild and got his brother's approval, Anchan could be promoted to leather rank. Joe gave her a supportive pat on the back, saying that he would vouch for her. He also shyly offered her the helmet as an early present. She smiled and accepted it. That evening, Joe returned to Sveni and was invited to President Antonio's house. President Antonio thanked him for his hard work in taking down the wyvern. As they walked together, Antonio requested that Joe make himself at home for the night. After his reincarnation, Joe had grown accustomed to staying up all night on guard duty. That's why he feels especially grateful for the comfort of this nice bedroom. As he's settling in, Belle calls his name, prompting him to turn toward her, curious. With her head bowed, she quietly informs him that the bath has been prepared. Joe smiles warmly and thanks her for the bath. He slips into the giant tub filled with steaming water, feeling immense gratitude for this moment of relaxation. As he leans back and closes his eyes, he reflects on how, despite being in a world filled with monsters, his GSDF equipment somehow still functions. He never imagined he'd have the chance to protect someone after his death. He wonders if the girls he's met feel the same way about protecting others as he does. His thoughts are suddenly interrupted when Belle pulls him back to the present. He turns to see her standing in the bathroom, wearing nothing but a towel. With a shy voice, she asks if she can wash his back. At first, Joe's mind races with excitement at the idea of being cared for by a maid, but he quickly pulls himself together, realizing this might not be such a good idea. Belle gently urges him to come closer. Joe thinks to himself that no amount of equipment or training could prepare him for this situation. Belle continues to wash Joe's back, though he finds it difficult to think clearly. He catches a pleasant scent, something beyond the soap, and mentally scolds himself for allowing her to help him with this. He steps back, takes the towel from her, and says he'll handle it himself. But in his embarrassment, he grabs the wrong towel. Belle tries to tell him it's hers, but he pulls it away too quickly, unintentionally exposing her. She lets out a surprised scream, and he quickly apologizes. Later, lying in bed, Joe reflects on his day. From battling the wyvern to bathing with Belle, he thinks to himself that it's been another day full of surprises. As he turns on his side, he realizes how exhausted he is. In his dreams, a familiar dark-haired girl named Hitomi appears, calling him Joe-kun and encouraging him to do his best. A tear slips down his cheek as he whispers her name. Walking around the estate with a towel around his neck, Joe notes it has been a few days since that incident. He's been staying at President Antonio's house since then. He encounters two beautiful women who greet him with equal respect and a bow, and he returns their greeting. He reflects on how polygamy seems common in this world, not just with Antonio. As a Japanese man, this concept surprises him. He realizes these women are Antonio's first and second wives. Belle approaches, and Joe turns to greet her, but they both fall silent, making things slightly awkward. Joe suggests they leave, as today they're visiting the production guild to check on the canning operation's progress. Since Antonio is busy, he has asked Joe to take Belle with him. Surrounded by a pile of paperwork, Antonio had said he'd love to go but couldn't. Antonio hands Joe two cans. One is the sample he provided, and the other is the prototype made by the guild. Holding the cans, Joe is impressed, noting he can't tell the difference and admires the clever technique of sealing with overlapping plates. He comments that they'll test the cans by adding food, heating it, letting the air escape, then sealing with wax to create a vacuum. Joe is impressed with the dwarf's speed in making this. The dwarf then tells Joe with a serious tone that he won't work for free. Joe, equally serious, assures him he understands. Later, the dwarf crashes into a wall while trying Joe's motorcycle. Emerging from the rubble, he declares it's challenging. It's clear that Tendar-san has a fascination with Joe's motorcycle and frequently asks to test drive it, though he always crashes. Joe marvels at the dwarf's resilience and notices the bike's suspension has bent. He's relieved he can summon a replacement if needed. Anchan greets them cheerfully, mentioning Belle's presence. She rushes over, saying she heard from the Merchants Guild that he was headed to the Production Guild. She then excitedly reveals an ID made from wyvern scale with a leather cover. Joe wonders aloud if she's been promoted to a leather ranker. Belle praises her, and Anchan laughs proudly, showing off the ID made by Tendar-san. The dwarf suddenly appears, reminding her she still hasn't paid him. She hesitates, asking if she can pay later, and he agrees without issue. Relieved, Anne wonders how much it will cost her, while Joe thinks to himself that Tendar's silence probably means he doesn't plan on charging her. He realizes dwarves can be shrewd. Meanwhile, Tendar privately considers the cost he incurred for the work. Belle asks Anchan if she has shown her ID to the director, and Anchan shyly replies that she's just about to. She suggests that Joe and Belle accompany her. Both Belle and Anchan grew up in the same orphanage, which is managed by the church. The director, Bishop Margaret, was their guardian, and she is currently bowing deeply to Joe. Joe asks Bishop Margaret to raise her head, but she insists she cannot. Bishop Margaret welcomes Joe as an apostle of the goddess, mentioning that she not only senses protection, but also sees a blessing upon him. She tells Joe she can perceive the goddess's blessing and protection. She explains that no apostle has received both a blessing and protection since the hero Kojiro-sama, and Joe looks at her curiously. She gestures to a portrait behind them. He quietly remarks that it depicts the old Japanese Army's Type 89 medium tank. The painting portrays the war against the demons, and seeing the tanks, Joe realizes Kojiro-san's blessing from the goddess might have been an inventory ability, just like his. As they walk back, Joe reflects, realizing he and Kojiro-san may share many similarities. He wishes he knew more about Kojiro-san. Behind him, both women seem nervous about Joe's role as an apostle. He turns to reassure them, and they join their hands, thinking he's speaking. He suggests they celebrate An-chan with a meal for him. Their faces light up. An-chan says she knows a good place and leads them to Marduk's restaurant, where Marduk welcomes them warmly, spatula in hand. She mentions it's been a while. Joe wonders if it's a teppanyaki stall. Marduk gives him a puzzled look, then exclaims he's the famous Explosive Joe. Joe is silent at this, while An-chan confirms that yes, he's Explosive Joe due to his incredible magic. Marduk is impressed, noting Joe appears like an ordinary guy. Joe feels embarrassed about the nickname and rubs his nose. Marduk promises to make something special for him. When the food arrives, Joe wonders if it's just okonomiyaki. An-chan enthusiastically says it looks delicious, cutting it skillfully, and Belle comments on An-chan's adept spatula handling. Joe recognizes this as a Kansai style of cutting. He wonders if this is another tradition Kojiro-san brought into this world. Belle observes that Jinguji-sama is deep in thought again. An-chan suggests they dig in, but their mood is disrupted by loud shouting nearby. A man yells, asking if someone has a problem with him. Joe and the others turn to see a confrontation. Marduk mutters that it's a fight, and in the distance they see a man lying on the ground with another man towering over him, sword at his waist. The man on the ground glares defiantly at the aggressor, who only becomes angrier. He curses and begins to unsheathe his sword. Someone in the crowd calls him Sergeant, reminding him they're in a city, but the sergeant ignores him, telling him to be quiet. The sergeant points his sword at the man on the ground, demanding to know his response. He offers forgiveness if the man apologizes now. The sergeant swings his sword. Joe rushes in to intervene, initially planning to give a warning but realizing it's too late. A loud bang grabs everyone's attention. They turn to see Joe standing with a gun in his hand, ordering the sergeant to drop his sword. The sergeant looks annoyed but notices the bullet mark on the rock beneath him. He questions Joe, asking about the magic he used, while his comrade whispers that this is bad, recognizing him as Explosive Joe. The sergeant mutters, realizing he's facing the Joe. Joe repeats his command, instructing the sergeant to drop his sword. Frustrated, the sergeant complains about the city's dullness, while the man on the ground tries to reason with him. Joe grabs the fallen man's hand, asking if he's all right. Despite being helped up, the man, distracted, points toward Marduk's stall, commenting on how delicious it smells. Later, the man eagerly devours food with Joe sitting beside him, noting that he must have been so hungry he nearly passed out. Joe tells him it's on the house and encourages him to eat as much as he likes. Belle blushes at Joe's generosity, while Marduk comments on how much the man is eating, wondering how long it's been since his last meal. Between mouthfuls, the man says he hasn't eaten in 2 days since arriving in Sveni. After finishing, he takes a deep breath and bows to Joe, thanking him sincerely for his kindness. The man introduces himself as Locke from a southern village, promising to repay Joe for his generosity one day, then takes his leave. Joe is glad Locke is doing better and asks An-chan if Locke's situation is common. An-chan replies that the sergeant also isn't from Sveni. After a moment of thought, she suggests he's likely a mercenary, one rumored about in the Adventurers Guild. Joe recalls hearing that mercenaries are arriving from Tars, a citadel to the west of Sveni. While Sveni has active adventurers and merchants guilds, Tars is said to be dominated by a powerful mercenary guild. Joe speculates about the previous altercation, suspecting Locke might have been the one to provoke the sergeant, and wonders about Locke's ties to the mercenaries. Marduk calls out to Joe, insisting on treating him to extra meat this time. Joe happily accepts, and Marduk adds that it's great to see Joe helping others. He compliments Joe's skill, noting that the dent in the ground near the sergeant's foot is truly impressive, explosive magic. Joe looks at the dent on the iron plate, and then at his plate of takoyaki, wondering if he could make something similar. The next day, he visits the orphanage with members of the Merchants Guild. Margaret announces to everyone that today, they'll be receiving a special treat from Jinguji-sama. She folds her hands and tells them to be patient and behave, as the children smile eagerly around her. Marduk and the dwarf approach Joe, proudly saying they've prepared what he asked for. Joe checks his wristwatch, noting that everything should be ready by now. Antonio chuckles, eyeing the plate of Osaka-style takoyaki, commenting that he's never seen anything like it before. Tendar grumbles as he eats, annoyed that Joe made him create a dented iron plate, though he admits it's impressive that dwarves could finish it overnight. Marduk joins in cheerfully, cooking the takoyaki with ingredients he sourced from the market. Joe uses dried seaweed and mushrooms for stock, pleased he found some dried octopus. When Eldra takes a bite, President Antonio exclaims in surprise, commenting on the octopus inside, remarking how unusual it is that such a fearsome creature can be eaten like this. His comment makes the elf lady pause mid-bite. Margaret expresses her heartfelt thanks for the unique and delicious treat. President Antonio laughs, praising Jinguji-sama's remarkable knowledge. He pulls Margaret aside to share a suggestion. They could make takoyaki an exclusive business for the orphanage, an idea he and Joe came up with the previous night. Since young people like An-chan, Belle, and Marduk often struggle before gaining independence, Antonio plans to handle the exclusivity arrangements. He adds that the market will thrive if more job opportunities are created. Joe watches from the shade of a tree, content to see the orphanage children enjoying the treat. Belle approaches him, holding back a smile as she thanks him for looking out for the orphanage. Blushing, she covers her face with her hands, saying he's been that way since they first met, strong, caring, and always helping others. Joe blushes, flustered at her compliment, and quickly returns to his food, saying he's just doing what he can. He admits that if he could help without using force, he'd be even happier. Later, at Sveni's southern west bank of the Great River, Joe considers he needs to practice with his new equipment. An-chan, seeing the large staff-like weapon, asks if that's what he means by training. Joe nods, advising her to stay clear as it could be dangerous. Checking his inventory, he's surprised to find new equipment added, likely a result of his monster-slaying efforts and recent rank increase. During the goddess's blessing lecture, he'd been advised to add more tools as he advanced. He scans the surroundings with binoculars, deciding that a distant boulder looks like a good target. He shoulders the 110mm Panzerfaust 3 anti-tank weapon. The missile obliterates the boulder entirely. An-chan mutters in amazement, noting that the boulder vanished. Joe remarks that he needs to be cautious with this weapon. An-chan then points out something alarming, saying it's not about needing another shot. She explains that the boulder is moving. Joe's eyes widen as he realizes the boulders are actually boulder giants, now awakened and moving to attack a nearby ship. An-chan, worried, says that if this keeps up, they'll end up heading straight towards Sveni. An-san and Joe rushed back to Sveni, reporting the situation to the Adventurers Guild and the city guards. Joe hands over his smartphone, explaining that, although it might sound unbelievable, it shows what they witnessed downstream along the Great River. Amanda, Goliath, and the Guildmaster are stunned by what they see. They realize it's a guardian golem. The guardian golem, an artifact from the ancient southern ruins, is said to remain dormant, but Goliath crosses his arms, admitting he's never heard of it actually moving. The guildmaster tells Joe that regardless, these golems are heading straight for Sveni. Joe confirms, prompting the guildmaster to call for Amanda under Albertson's guidance. Meanwhile, the people near the river port are swiftly evacuated into the city, and those with long-range magic and bows are positioned atop the walls to intercept the golems. Joe tells Amanda he'll intercept the approaching golems outside the east gate. She acknowledges his plan and wishes him luck. Anchan calls out in concern, but Joe reassures her that he'll be fine. He asks her to monitor the golem's movements from above, trusting her sharp eyesight. With newfound determination, she tells him to leave it to her. Joe swiftly exits through the east gate. However, the golems are already nearing the shore. Reaching an ideal vantage point, Joe prepares his spell and readies his weapons, summoning another one. This time, a freaking machine gun, hoping it can deal damage. Using his binoculars, he spots the same ship from earlier and realizes the golems are pursuing its crew. He notices the crew loading items onto a wagon and hears an unusual sound. It's the golem. Something is forming on its face. Moments later, a fireball blasts from the golem toward the ship at close range, striking it. Joe manages to keep his balance but recognizes the danger. The golem can use offensive magic. In response, he takes aim with his 12.7mm M2 heavy machine gun, mounted on an M3 tripod, and fires at the guardian golems. The shot hits one golem's arm, dislodging it. Seeing the significant damage, Joe continues firing, unleashing a barrage of bullets at the golems. This time, Joe's bullets strike the golem's face. He continues the barrage for a few more seconds, causing the guardian golem to collapse into the seawater. The guards cheer as they watch, exclaiming that Joe has sealed its magic and disabled its legs. Gilbert shouts in excitement, noting that it's working. Just then, Anchan calls out to Joe in alarm, warning him that more golems are on their way. As more guardian golems approach, Joe realizes he's got their full attention. He keeps firing, but suddenly one golem grabs another by the arm and hurls it in Joe's direction. It hurtles toward him at a frightening speed, leaving him momentarily frozen in shock. The unexpected move leaves everyone stunned. Gilbert exclaims in disbelief that the golem threw its own ally, while Anchan shouts Joe's name in concern. Fortunately, Joe manages to jump out of the way at the very last second. The hurled golem crashes into a nearby building. Meanwhile, the remaining golem is already advancing toward Joe. He stands his ground, preparing something in response. It's clear to both of them that one of them might not survive this encounter. Then, out of nowhere, a fucking missile launcher appears in Joe's hands, and he fires it straight at the golem. The giant stone ass creature has no chance to dodge. The missile's impact causes its head to crumble. Gilbert shouts in amazement that Joe actually did it. Anchan, too, sighs in relief. As Joe turns to give them a thumbs up with a smile, the golem unexpectedly rises again and begins launching fireballs. But this time, they're not aimed at Joe. They're directed toward the opposite side of the wall. The fireballs hit the nearby houses, sending people into a panic. Just as they believed they were safe, the situation takes a terrifying turn. Gilbert shields Anchan from the explosion. Moments later, another massive fireball is seen heading directly toward them. Anchan freezes in place, and Joe's face fills with despair as he realizes there's nothing he can do to stop it. Goliath steps forward with his shield, telling everyone to stand back. He positions himself, bracing for impact. The fireball collides with his shield, leaving barely a scratch. Joe feels relieved to see him there. Tendar, the dwarf, remarks that they arrived just in time. Gilbert excitedly pats Goliath on the head, exclaiming that his iron shield has finally been repaired. Apparently, Tendar specially modified it with wyvern scales. Joe glances over at the fallen golem, noting that it's no longer moving. He wonders why these golems went after that particular ship. Amanda rushes over to Joe, calling out to him in worry. Joe thanks her for guiding the civilians to safety. She informs him that she received an urgent message about the South Gate. It's been breached. As people begin fleeing from the south, they report seeing another golem, one that looks vastly different from the others. Joe curses and races toward the south gate on his motorcycle. He hadn't expected there to be another golem. In the distance, he sees the head of an armored golem rising up. It appears to be searching for something, and Joe wonders what it's after. Looking through his binoculars, he spots the same man from the ship now riding a cart, carrying the same cargo. Joe realizes that the golem is pursuing the ship's cargo. The man on the cart curses, frustrated at how relentless the golem's pursuit has been. Taking a shortcut, Joe rushes to intercept the armored golem and prepares to summon another Panzerfaust III. But when he notices people hiding inside a nearby building, he realizes he can't use it without risking collateral damage. Joe realizes, with dread, that the golem has stopped right in front of Margaret's orphanage. The man on the cart is now holding Belle hostage, his sword at her neck, while his companion has grabbed a child. The man smugly declares that the golem won't attack as long as they use the children as shields. The sergeant instructs his companion to place the children inside the wagon. The man tightens his grip on Belle, making her wince, and says she's coming with him. With a smug grin, he warns the golem to stay put. He mutters that amidst this chaos, they've managed to acquire quite a few new stocks, glancing at the children they've captured. The golem finally moves to strike him, but Joe intercepts it, driving in with a powerful clawed vehicle designed for disaster relief by Hitachi construction machinery. Belle stares in confusion, muttering about an iron crab, before realizing that Joe is inside the machine. The golem grabs the pincers of Joe's vehicle, and Joe notes that their strength seems evenly matched. Joe decides to pull out his long rifle and shoot, but his bullets simply bounce off the golem's armor. He notes that his firing position is poor, with his aim angled downward. Frustrated, Joe adjusts his goggles, cursing the awkward angle. He wonders if he could manage a shot to the golem's eye. They lock eyes, and suddenly, the golem releases its grip on the pincers and steps back. Joe is surprised that it stopped fighting, wondering what caused it. Then, the golem begins to glow. Its eyes open, revealing Locke at the center, looking visibly distressed. Joe stares in shock, taken aback by the unexpected sight. Joe asks Locke why he was inside the golem, but Locke faints before he can respond, and with him, the golem collapses. It narrowly misses the carriage and the sergeant, though one of the sergeant's men injures his knee in the chaos. The children inside the carriage urge each other to escape and run. The sergeant coldly places his foot on his injured companion, who looks up in confusion. With a deadly glare, the sergeant calls him a fool, ordering him to focus on the fleeing slaves. Joe's eyes widen as he realizes what's happening, piecing everything together. The wagon is filled with children intended for the slave trade. This is why the golem had been chasing it. A woman steps out of the wagon, chains clinking as she moves. She sees the fallen golem and calls out to her big brother, Locke. The woman starts running toward Locke, but before she can reach him, the sergeant drives his sword into the chains around her legs, causing her to stumble. The sergeant mutters that she's the one he's after. Realizing the danger, Joe becomes tense, but the sergeant turns to him, calling him a magician and ordering him to drop his weapon. The sergeant wanted Joe's wand to be thrown at him. Joe complies, tossing his gun to the ground. Satisfied, the sergeant looks at the immobilized golem, muttering that it seems unable to move. Locke, looking both angry and exhausted, shouts at the sergeant to stay away from his sister Miranda. The sergeant glares back, calling Locke a brat and accusing him of interfering with his business. He raises his sword to kill Miranda, taunting Locke to sit back and watch his sister die. But before he can strike, a girl with long black hair pulls his sword with her chains, urging Miranda to escape. The sergeant, undeterred, yanks her by the hair, declaring that they'll all die today. As he moves to strike, a magical barrier appears, slicing his sword in two. He curses, noticing a magic circle behind the girl's head. Before he can attack again, Joe seizes the moment, summoning his pistol and aiming at the sergeant's hand. The shot lands, causing the sergeant to release his sword and clutch his bleeding hand. Joe warns him not to move, saying it's his final warning. Furious, the sergeant bites his lip, but Amanda-san and her security team arrive, quickly arresting the slavers. It turns out, these mercenaries from the Citadel of Tars are members of a dark guild involved in human trafficking. They will face trial by the Sveni Guild Council. The guards carefully extract Locke from the golem. He sees his sister Miranda waiting for him. Fortunately, Locke's golem caused no casualties. Joe feels relieved as he supports the black-haired girl, thinking Locke will likely face trial as well. Given the siblings' reunion under these circumstances, Joe hopes to help them in reducing Locke's charges. He wonders, though, how Locke acquired the power to control the golem. As Joe supports the girl, she begins to fidget, but he tells her to stay still, holding her by the shoulder and suspecting she may be injured. He wraps a cloth around her ankle, thanking her for her earlier display of impressive defensive magic. Then, as he finally looks at her face, his words falter. In her face, he recognizes Hitomi. Memories start flooding back to him. Joe uses his iron crab machine to help remove the damaged doors. Gilbert mutters that with Joe's iron crab, they should be able to repair the gate much faster as they work on raising the new door. It's been a week since the incident. Joe gives Locke a thumbs up, praising his efforts. Locke smiles, pleased by the gesture. Following the trial, Locke was sentenced to supervised probation and required to stay in Sveni to serve the city. His lenient sentence was due to his youth being only 18, and the fact that he was trying to save his sister. Margaret-san places a hand on Locke's head, saying she believes he's blessed by the goddess. Joe explains that Locke's ability to control the golem likely came from the goddess's power. Locke looks surprised. Miranda glances at him, asking if he was unknowingly controlling the golem. Locke nods, saying he acted out of desperation, which makes Margaret laugh. She advises him to learn to harness his abilities. It's decided that Locke will need guidance with his powers, and Joe is assigned as his mentor. Together, they work on rebuilding the city. Locke excitedly asks Joe where they should go next to help, just as he hears someone calling his name. He turns to see a few ladies on the bridge, admiring him and noting how young he is. They cheerfully call out to him, telling him to look their way. It's clear the people of Sveni have taken a liking to him, and he gives them a thumbs up, making them squeal with excitement. The children nearby are also thrilled, exclaiming over the real iron crab. The girl Joe initially mistook for Hitomi is there as well, watching the children and remarking on the crab's size. The little girl holding her hand calls her Nakrian Oni-shan. At that moment, Margaret announces it's time for lunch. The children rush back eagerly, but Nekrian stays behind. The little girl asks if she's coming with them, but Nekrian declines, encouraging the girl to go ahead. Joe observes from his seat in the iron crab. He knows this is Nekrian, a girl freed from slavery, but he thinks that she does look like Hitomi. Nekrian approaches him, holding the cloth he had wrapped around her ankle, and thanks him for his help, offering the cloth back. A sudden gust of wind sweeps the cloth away, and she apologizes as they watch it flutter off. Joe reassures her, saying he can easily get another from his inventory. He gazes at her with a hint of longing, but then clenches his fist, reminding himself to stay grounded. He tells himself that this can't be Hitomi, as he vividly recalls the news of terrorist attacks in Japan, where Hitomi lost her life. Belle approaches Joe to thank him for his hard work and informs him that they're ready to view the property. Agreeing, Joe calls over to Locke, letting him know it's time to check out the house. Locke eagerly complies, leaving the ladies behind, who promise to see him later. As Locke's guardian, Joe has encouraged him to be independent and acquire a home in Svenny. The previous day, Joe had discussed this with Antonio, who confirmed that Locke's income was sufficient and offered to help find suitable properties, moving quickly to arrange viewings. Necrian excuses herself, and Belle notices Joe's somber expression as he watches her walk away. After a moment's thought, Belle calls out to Necrian, inviting her to join them. Necrian looks at her in surprise. As they explore the property, Locke remarks on its size, and Joe explains it was originally an inn. Locke excitedly suggests placing a golem in the open space by the entrance, clearly in high spirits. When Joe checks the bathroom, he can't help but smile, pleased to find a bathtub on the second floor with a nice view. Meanwhile, Belle tries to make conversation with Necrian, asking what she thinks of the place. Necrian hesitates, looking unsure. Necrian hesitantly asks Belle if she minds being around her, admitting that she has demon blood and wondering if Belle remembers her magic from earlier. Joe pauses, overhearing this, while Necrian lowers her gaze. But Belle reassures her, saying that as a girl she can't let the boys be the only ones deciding where they'll live. Belle notes that the house is large and difficult to maintain. With the upstairs bath, they'd likely need 3 maids to keep it in order, and she questions if they can afford that. Both Locke and Joe are impressed by her practical perspective. Belle then puts an arm around Necrian, saying that if there are 2 boys here, the girls need 2 voices as well, or they'll be outnumbered. Necrian, though shy, mentions that placing the golem at the entrance would block sunlight since it's on the south side. Locke suggests putting it in the north backyard, but Necrian points out that it would disturb the neighbors. Joe nods, agreeing with her logic. Necrian glances at Belle, who is pleased to hear her input, then gently pulls her arm, suggesting they check out the next property. Joe smiles, watching Belle. They continue through a few properties, noting the girls' rejections and discussing various options. Finally, they arrive at the last property on the north edge of the city. As they stand outside, Locke comments that this one feels simpler compared to the previous ones, and Belle agrees, noting its modest size. Necrian observes that placing the golem on the north wall would avoid inconveniencing anyone, and Belle counts the rooms, concluding that a single maid could maintain it. The men are equally pleased, as the bath is on the first floor, and they have a suitable space for the golem. Joe notices An-chan carrying luggage and asks her about it. She explains that, due to age restrictions, she must leave the guild dormitory. Antonio suggested that she live with Joe and Truck-kun instead. President Antonio, meanwhile, is writing her a letter of recommendation and will provide them with a maid in exchange for more roommates. An-chan exclaims that she's excited to live with Belle-chan again, just like in their orphanage days. President Antonio instructs Eldra to prepare the employment contract. Joe realizes that Antonio arranged for all of them to live together, creating a supportive and friendly environment. He later heard that the house had originally belonged to Antonio-san. He is guessing President Antonio deliberately showed them the properties that did not meet their requirements first. From Belle-san to the property, he knew that Joe would be reluctant if he offered it directly to him. Joe thinks he really got him there in the end. He kept taking care of him since yesterday. Eldra, the elf assistant, asks if she may take her leave, and President Antonio thanks her for arranging things, adding that this setup will allow Locke to register with the Adventurers Guild, even while on probation. Joe expresses his gratitude when he meets Antonio in the office. Antonio remarks that Joe was right. Locke's skills are suited for adventuring, and continues with Necrian's case. Joe listens attentively as Antonio explains that, as a member of the demon tribe, Nekrian faces challenges due to lingering prejudice from the last war. Even after her release, she may struggle to live independently. However, Antonio reveals that he's already made arrangements. There's been a prior case of a demon registering as an adventurer, and he'll work with Albert Dono to help Nekrian. Joe smiles, pleased with this plan. Back at home, Joe offers Nekrian some takoyaki, encouraging her not to hold back. She thanks him, and he, in turn, thanks her for helping them choose the house, feeling that this is already turning into a great home. She comments that this feels like a thank you, and he clarifies it's more than that. Rubbing the back of his head, he decides to get to the point. He asks if she'd like to become an adventurer and join a party with him and the others.